Hello.
Hello. Hey, we wish we could be there with you, except nobody's
Yes.
there.
Yeah, but we're here in these little bubbles.
These little orbs. I'm in the left bubble. My name is Stephen Duncombe, and I'm a sociologist. And along with the bubble to my right, a co-founder of the Center for Artistic Activism.
Yeah, and I'm Steve Lambert. I am trained as an artist and am co-founder with Steve of the Center for Artistic Activism. We're a nonprofit based here in the United States. And it's probably easier just to show you a little bit of what we do, and then we can talk about some of the details. So here we go with that.
How can artists create social change? Like many countries around the world, Macedonia has a big problem with corruption. People have to pay bribes for basic services. Macedonians want change, but corruption runs deep. It's not just a legal or political problem, but a cultural one. To change the culture of corruption, we need the power of art and the creativity of artists. That's the mission of the Art Action Academy. The Art Action Academy has been taught by the Center for Artistic Activism to artists around the world. In June of 2018, 17 local artists participated in Skopje, Macedonia in a 5-day training workshop. The workshop dives into applied cultural theory and cognitive and social theory with guided exercises and creative tactical planning. The culmination of the workshop is the exam, a creative public action that the workshop participants collaboratively conceive of, build, and implement all within 24 hours. In Skopje, this group created a fictitious organization for the equitable distribution of bribes. They created a huge red bribery box so that people could pay their bribes openly and in public. Then the group hit the streets, staging a solemn procession to a soundtrack of Pink Floyd's Money and ABBA's Money Money as they wove through downtown Skopje. Stopping at key locations, they invited people on the street to give bribes and talk about corruption. The procession went to places where corruption happens, like the hospital, and government buildings, including the State Commission for Preventing Corruption. This is where the local news media showed up and covered the action. Finally, the group dropped the box off at the public prosecutor's office, where it was left so that they could find it on Monday morning. The artists then reflected on the action and the whole week, drawing lessons to take forward as they plan their own projects to help transform Macedonia into the more equitable, just society that they envision.
So that is generally how our workshops run. And that example is from Macedonia, but
But
we've
we
worked.
work on a whole range of issues, not just corruption. As you can see here, we've worked on things like Roma discrimination against Roma, LGBT rights, sex workers' rights, paid sick leave, maternal health. Right now, we're engaged in two campaigns: one on corruption in both the Western Balkans and in West Africa, and also a large campaign globally around making the COVID vaccine freely accessible to anybody who needs it, and to pull it out of the realm of private property and profit and make it freely create. Actually, Steve, you say that. What are
Accessible and
we doing?
affordable to everyone who
Thank you.
cares to
That
take
was
it.
what I was looking
Yeah.
for.
And we've worked in all these different regions around the world. I think it's about 15 or 16 different countries now. And basically, the big question that or the thing that we were trying to do is make artwork, like
Yeah,
make art instrumental, essentially.
right. Exactly. And what do we mean by making artwork? It's exactly this idea of instrumentality, which is using art as an instrument, in one case, for example, that we just saw, to stem corruption. But Steve, you're an artist. You've been trained as an artist. When artists think about instrumentality, I don't know. They often say, we don't want art to be instrumental, right?
Right. I mean, usually in most fields, something being instrumental describes it as being like a key to this happening and the success. Like the surgery was instrumental to the patient's recovery. And for some reason in the arts, it's seen as a like a threat or
A
a
detriment.
problem. Yeah, exactly. So we think about instrumentality in a different way, partly because we understand that art has always been instrumental.
Yeah, I mean, whether art was instrumental to sort of pay homage to the hunt, for example, and some of the earliest arts,
Or
or
gods and deities, and like the art's always been commissioned by rich families, often connected to power. Here we have aristocracy, and Steve's favorite guy.
yes, it actually, I mean, if nothing else says power, that says power,
Right.
right? And art has always been used instrumentally for religion, for power, for bring favors from the gods or the animals. And that's not that different than today, right, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, there's this belief among artists that things are a little bit different now and that we can escape this and that art can be just about art and not beholden to powerful interests. But we know, as if you know art well, that's not true and never been true, and it's probably at its worst right now. But there is like this other idea of kind of the
Art
weekend painter and artist for art's sake.
Yes, which really came out as a sort of 19th century ideology that art was supposed to be somehow separate from the world. But the irony, of course, is that it was used as an instrumental act to critique an instrumental society. So even art's anti-instrumentalism, we would argue, has an instrumental function.
Right. And so we've just embraced instrumentality, and our mission is to help artists make their work more instrumental.
Right. And in this way, what we're interested in is using art as a form of activism, activism as a form of art, and kind of merging the two as artistic activism, which raises, of course, a big question, Steve.
What is artistic activism?
Exactly. And so there's no way we can answer that right here. We'd be here for hours and not days. What we are going to show you is 4 or 5 examples that have inspired us, and it'll give you a sense of what the parameters of artistic activism might be.
Right.
The first one is by his artist, Candy Chang. She's an American artist. She lives now in New York, but she was living in New Orleans during the massive hurricane and then flood of that city. Steve, if you can show a picture of that. And there it is. And as the floodwaters receded, of course, what ended up happening is you had a lot of condemned buildings and a lot of talk about how to rebuild the city of New Orleans. But of course, the only people that were talking were real estate developers and bankers and politicians. And everyday people of New Orleans were not being asked how they wanted to see their city rebuilt. And so Candy did something really simple and what we think is quite effective. She had these little stickers printed up, kind of like the stickers you wear at a conference, like we'd be wearing at this conference if we were actually in Finland. And they just said, I wish this was. And then she posted them up around all of the boarded up buildings, and then people would write what they wanted to see. A butcher shop, a bakery, a grocery locally owned, or a community center, or a bike rack, or a home. And the idea here is really this notion of it was a very simple gesture, a very artistic gesture, but it opened up a space for everyday people to, one, express what they wanted their city to be, and also perhaps critically question, why am I not being asked how I want my city to look? Why is it just an art project that gives me this space and not a governmental field?
This next example is called Journal Rapé. It's done by 2 guys that go by Human and KT, and they're based in Senegal. And basically, they realize that a lot of, well, corruption is a really big problem, and that anyone sort of presenting in a suit and trying to present authoritatively usually was corrupt. So that was a problem. But also that over time, that corruption takes hold in people and makes them kind of apathetic. And a lot of young people just didn't pay attention to the news and weren't interested and felt that it wasn't for them or anything that they had control over. And so they created a news show, and I'm going to show you a quick clip of it. But it's basically like a hip hop mixtape combined with in-depth
It-
reporting, kind of like John Oliver, but to a beat. And here it is.
Microphone check, 1, 2. Salam alaikum. Bonjour. Ok. Bienvenue, installez-vous, on a des nouvelles pour vous. Il y a de bonnes, il y a de mauvaises, mais il y a des nouvelles pour vous. Bienvenue, installez-vous, on a des nouvelles pour vous. Il y a de bonnes, il y a de mauvaises, mais il y a des nouvelles pour vous. Incendie à la Médina, c'est
If you speak French, you're fortunate. There are some videos where they have English subtitles, but you can see here there's music. The music goes all the way through the whole show. They put them out online, and this format spread to other countries. And so you'd see different kinds of journal rapé show up in different parts of the world. My favorite one was in Jamaica, and it was a dance hall news show. But this gives you an idea of what journal rapé does, and I definitely recommend checking it out online.
Yeah. And it really gets at the key of artistic activism insofar as what it's working with is local culture. And what they understood is the local culture of young people, which make up 60% of Senegal, was hip hop. And so, in order to be taken seriously, in order for anybody to show any interest, they needed to do hip hop news. The next, we're going to go around the world. This is from Chongqing, China. And Chinese cities, if you've ever been in one, you know this. They have a big problem with pollution. I think the only time I stopped smoking for a while is when I was in a Chinese city because I didn't need to anymore. And so you have activists who are protesting against the pollution, particularly the lack of government action for banning coal-fired power plants and such. But activists in China have a problem. They can't protest. If they protest, what they will do is they will get arrested and put under surveillance, and so on and so forth. And so a group of activist artists in Chongqing, China, did this very clever thing. They staged a protest that wasn't a protest. Instead, what it was a series of performances that you'd see every day in a city in China. Things like people taking getting the photographs taken before they got married, or the next slide, Steve, is essentially
It's a ballet.
a ballet procession, exactly. And just these really beautiful little quaint moments, snaps of light, but wearing gas masks. And the brilliance of this is that everybody who went by understood that it was a protest against government inaction on smog. The police even understood that it was a protest, but because it wasn't politics, which announced itself as politics, it could fly under the radar.
This next one takes place in Bogota, Colombia, from 1995, and it's still happening. We'll talk about that in a second. But it's a very creative way that to think about old problems. So in Bogota, a lot of people didn't respect the traffic signals, both pedestrians and cars. And there were a lot of traffic accidents because of it. And so Anatonis Makis was elected mayor in the mid 90s, and he had kind of a different approach. And so what he did was first they found out that a lot of the traffic officers were corrupt, and so he fired them all. But then he offered to hire them back if they would be willing to work as mimes. And he turned all the traffic uh, officers into mimes. And the reason that he did this was because, well, one, it's fun. But the other,
if you like mimes, it's fun. I
yeah,
find it a little horrifying, but
yeah. But the other reason that he did it was that he found out that people didn't really respect the law. And so he, but they did not want to be embarrassed in public.
yeah.
So the ticket wasn't enough of a disincentive, but being mocked by a mime was. And after implementing this, traffic fatalities dropped by 50% in a very quick time.
Yeah.
And it also spread to other countries. And so some of those pictures that you saw are in Venezuela, and I think in Bolivia right now they have traffic zebras that are kids dressed like zebras that dance in traffic in order to get cars to slow down. So
And
yeah, it's spread. It's another project that's spread.
yeah, and a couple of things that are interesting about that. One is, as Steve pointed out, there was a social science research component of that, which is Antanas Makas actually used surveyors. He used to be actually, I believe, the provost of local university, and they actually went out and did surveys about what people respected and what people did not respect, and that's where he got the idea of saving face was more important to people than um, fealty to the law, for example. The other thing to draw away from that is it didn't really work as well in places like Caracas. You can imagine, in our home city, people would just hit the mimes in New York City. That again, it goes back to knowing the local culture and working off that culture. This is going to bring it a little closer to home, or where we wish we were right now. This is actually a bit of artistic activism from Helsinki, Finland during HIV Awareness Week. I don't think it needs an introduction. We should just roll it.
No ei se nyt tunnu enää niin pahalle. Tästä on 8 vuotta sitten aikaa jo, että tää nyt on ihan silleen tutuksi tullut jo tää asia mulle, mutta kun se ei edelleenkään ole tuttu kaikille, niin ihan hyvä, että mä en ole vaarallinen ihminen enkä tartutakaan ihmisiä sillä, että voidaan ihan kosketellakin. Kiitos. 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 Oi. Kiitos paljon teille, kiitos.
Hyvää kesää, tsemppiä.
Kiitos samoin, kiitos. Oi.
Hei.
Ei, kiitos. Kiitos, thank you. Hyvä. Kiitos. Kiitos. Kiitos.
Kiitos.
Kiitos. Kiitos. Kiitos.
Steve, you want to comment on that? I think I'm supposed to say you're on mute at this point.
We had to do that once. No, I was just saying that gets me every time because he's totally made himself vulnerable, and there's a sincerity to it. But also having watched it, I don't know how many times we present this in workshops as an example of artistic activism. When you watch it that many times, you see the editing. And what's amazing about the editing and the music is that I think it better tells what his experience of it was than just planting like a security camera kind of objective view of what actually what happened in the order and the timing of it all. Like when you see it, the way that he shows it, including his sort of getting set up and drawing out the signs all the way to the end, there's an emotional, like it's authentic emotionally in a way that that's where the craft of that video comes in.
Right. And he really moves it from an action into a performance and makes it a form of art, which, like most forms of art, actually, even though it is a performance, as Steve said, it is somehow more authentic, or at least is able to communicate an authenticity in such a way that it becomes a powerful experience.
So this is another work called the 24-Hour Museum. It's kind of a favorite of ours. It's done by a guy named Alfredo Yar, who one of the things that happens when you're kind of a successful artist is you get invited to go to different parts of the world and to make projects. And Alfredo was invited to go to Skoghall, Sweden. This is Skoghall, if you've never been. It's a logging town, and they make paper. So they cut down trees and then put them on these giant rolls, and it's like a plastic coated paper that you would use in to produce milk cartons. And they gave him the tour and they walked him around and they said, we really appreciate you coming. And they wanted to brag about the town. And so they said, hey, here's our library, that we built. Here's our gym. And as Alfredo went around, he learned that all the infrastructure of the town was built by the city because there was only one industry. And everyone that worked in the town worked for the paper factory. So the factory built the library, the factory built the gym, the factory built the grocery store, and it's a company town, right?
Yeah.
So Alfredo said, "Oh, go ahead."
No, I was just going to say, and because it's a social democracy, it's actually pretty good. I mean, it's pretty sweet life.
Yeah, very comfortable. And Alfredo said, "Oh, where's the museum?" And they said, "Actually, we don't have a museum. That's why we bring artists in." And he's like, "Okay. So what I'm going to propose as my project is I'm going to build you a museum. And I'm going to build it out of the wood and the paper that you used in your factories. And this is what that museum looked like." So over time, they're constructing it. He has a background as an architect, so he knows how to build it. And they use the wood from the trees, and they use the plastic coated paper, and they make this museum. And then he had all the people in the town put their art in it. And so when the museum opened, everyone in town showed up, and they had the mayor came and cut a ribbon. There was an oompa band that played because it's Sweden and you have to do that, I guess. And then everyone crowded in for the opening to see the artwork done by their fellow residents of this town. And what they then started to notice is what it was called the 24-Hour Museum. And they said, "Hey, is this called the 24-Hour Museum because it's open 24 hours?" And he said, "No, it's called the 24-Hour Museum because in 24 hours, I'm going to burn it down." And they said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa. You can't burn down the museum. We like this museum." And he said, "No, that's my project. That's what I'm going to do." And so those people went to the mayor and they said, "This artist is nuts. He's going to burn down the museum. We can't let that happen. We like the museum. We want it to stay." And the mayor said, "Yeah, sorry, we already signed the contract and that's the deal. Like, we're burning down the museum." And so then they got some more people together and they went to the fire department and they said to the fire department, "This artist and the mayor, they've lost their minds. They're going to burn down the museum." And the fire department said, "No, no, no, no. They're not burning down the museum. We're burning down the museum." And at the end of the 24 hours, the fire department came and did a controlled burn. They took out all the art and they set the whole thing on fire and burned down the 24-hour museum. Now,
That's kind of messed up, Steve.
yeah, it kind of is, right? And this is often what people say when we talk about this project at this point. They're like, "This is wrong. This is incredibly disempowering." And it's kind of what made the project so amazing. And I think Alfredo, as a practitioner, is that, he left. They set the museum on fire and he left town. And what's amazing is the second part, right? So I think he said 6 weeks later.
Yeah, 6 weeks later, he's sitting in his office and he gets a call. And who's the call from? It's the mayor. And the mayor says, "Look, for the first time in the history of this town, the people have organized themselves and demanded something from the city government. They want a museum, and they want you to build it. And so he came back and he actually built a museum. But it's the first time in history that these people who were part of the social democracy company town actually felt the need to organize together to demand something. And so the brilliance of Alfredo Jarre is that he used this piece to actually cultivate a desire for something that these people didn't even know they had.
Right. And so these examples, these are ones that we've used. They all come from the past, say 10 or 20 years at the most. And as we started researching artistic activism, we dug a little bit back into history, and there was an interesting thing that we found.
Yeah, that most successful activism has been artistic. We could do countless examples, but just very briefly, going to use one or two from the US civil rights movement. And probably most people know this picture. It's Rosa Parks. And as the story goes, Rosa Parks was a tired seamstress who sat down on a bus, was asked to get up by a white man, as was the custom and the law of the southern United States in the 1950s, and she refused. And in that refusal, triggered the bus boycott, which was true, but it also wasn't true. The fact is, Rosa Parks was a committed activist. She was the secretary of the local NAACP. She had a long history in activism, and she did her act as a performance because she knew exactly what the response was going to be and what the effect that she wanted it to have. The next picture, this is a wide angle shot. And you see this white man in the back. And, for years, I always thought, that's the white man. That's the white man that she wouldn't give the seat up to.
Then I realized the guy that said,
that's
hey, you got to move.
Exactly. Then, of course, you think about it for a second. You're like, that's ridiculous. Okay. He's not going to sit there for that. And wait a second. How's the photographer there in the first place? And of course, did a little digging. And this picture was taken a year later. And that white man there, he was a local AP reporter. And the photographer said, we need a little contrast. Go sit up there, white man, and provide that epic photo. And what this was about, and this is civil rights movement was genius at doing this. We could talk more about it, but I think we're going to have to skip over some slides. But they were brilliant at performing reality, making the invisible visible, because they understood that systematic racism, white supremacy, and violence was something that happened after the sun went down. It happened in the Black neighborhoods. It was not something that the world saw. And their job was to make it into a performance, into an image, into a spectacle that then could be transported via pictures, news stories, and so on to the rest of the world. And they're brilliant at it.
Yeah, I think that's a sort of unsung sort of accomplishment was how well they orchestrated and masterminded those kinds of performances, right? Like Rosa Parks was not like she was there for it. She designed it that way. So what is artistic activism?
Yeah, we're going to ask this question a number of times and answer it many different ways. If
Right.
that was the examples, here's the more theoretical side.
So on the one hand, you have activism, which is more, we think about it as thinking about outcomes, right? How do we get to this outcome? How do we change this law? How do we end this injustice or begin this new policy? The activism is more oriented towards effect.
Right. And the second part of artistic activism is, of course, the art. And art, we actually tend to think of more as a personal experience. And we tend to think of it not in instrumental terms, as we started out, but in more emotional terms, although we're going to argue that the emotional has an instrumental capacity. But we tend to think of art in its terms of generation affect. And so one of the ways you can think about this is affective effect, or another might be effective affect. But, because we're, artists and scholars, we had to come up with our own words. So Steve busted in my office one time and he said, we keep messing up these words. So I got a new one for us.
Affect.
Affect, or because we're in your part of the world, effect.
But I like affect.
Yeah, Steve likes affect, and it's like a pirate would say it.
Yes. So yeah, affect is the combination of affect and effect, and we talk about it as like affect leads to effect, that these two things go together. And when we think about the examples that we showed, that those things go together, that the emotional impact of, say, that the both the museum burning down or the guy standing in Helsinki is what leads to change.
Mhm.
That without it, you're just sort of on a soapbox ranting or writing policy papers. Now, all those examples too provide a pretty broad spectrum of possibilities for artistic activism.
Right. And we've actually generated a database called actipedia.org, in which we have 2,500 different examples. So, and they're all user generated. But the point is it's a big field. But even when it's a big field, when we talk to art schools, for example, the first question that goes up is, but is this even art?
Right. And
Steve, you went to art school, so
I know this
so
is
that's
um, for me, it's what is art is like the most boring question, because I've heard it so often, but also it can never be answered because there's so many different kinds of art and art, and there's art worlds. So there's like a commercial art world, there's like this nonprofit, there's more activist leaning stuff, there's craft, there's like, and so art, it's just easier not to go there.
right. And so
Yeah,
we got a bunch of sociologists here, so we know you don't care about that necessarily, but you got another question, which is, does it
does it even
does it even
work?
work? Okay,
Yeah,
which is it actually effective? Is we're promoting this idea that affect is the really the combination of the effect and affect that makes up artistic activism, but does it actually work? And this is something that we're really interested in. If we're going to talk about art's instrumentality, we really have to interrogate whether art actually works. And then as soon as we think of that, we have to ask the question, how do we know if it works? And so we've been doing a lot of work on that question.
right. We've done research, we interrogate it, we break it down, we test it, and
There it is. There's our laboratory.
yeah, this is we once we've really boiled it down,
Right.
we actually, Steve came up with this formula.
Yeah, we did. We did do research, and here's the formula.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah. There it is. That's the formula whether artistic activism actually works.
Yeah, you just plug in the numbers, right?
Yeah, exactly. So,
Okay,
seriously,
but
give them the
let's
next
break
one.
it down. Let's
We'll break it
yeah,
down. Okay. So basically, success is something pretty simple, which is, if you do the next slide, Steve, or
yep,
the next little click on the slide, success equals the delta A, which is the actual I effect, being divided by the desired I effect. Okay. What that translates out into is something really simple, which is intent versus outcome. Did what you want to have happen actually happen? Um,
now
there
I
you
gotta
go, Steve.
say, art is never this simple, right? And when Steve
Aha.
brought me this formula, I was like, no, art isn't that simple. And so he did me a
Yeah, so
favor.
most artists want to do multiple things. That's why we have the multivariable. So you can plug in a multiplicity of ideas of success, that's SX, and thereby have a multiplicity of desired effects over actual outcomes. So
Right.
there you go.
And again, I say art is never this simple. There's unintended sort of outcomes. There's the success that you might have that wasn't part of the original plan.
Yeah. But I can account for that as well. So,
Okay.
with my model, then all we have to do is add an SY. And what the SY is success, of course, that you didn't intend for.
Okay.
So there you go. I mean, I've given a lot of thought, Steve. So, I'm the guy with the PhD. So I'm the guy who came up with the formula.
All right. So we've got this formula. It works. It's been interrogated. It's complete. Now there might be some questions in the audience, and I think I know what they are. Maybe we can telepathically guess what some of the questions are. And it is, are you guys serious? And the answer, of course, is no.
No, ish. Right. I mean, look, it does work. By the way, the formula totally does work, but it only works if you plug in numbers. And the problem is that art isn't reducible to numbers. There's very few things that art does or artists want art to do that can actually be quantified. So, no, it doesn't work.
Right. And also if we were to show this to actual artists in practice, they would get scared of us and probably not speak to us anymore and avoid us. And it's not a thing that we bust out in our workshops and start plugging numbers into. So are we serious? No. But
We are
yes.
kind of serious. Yeah. I mean, what is it? It's a heuristic tool. It really goes back to that kind of a way of thinking about the most essential part of any sort of assessment of artistic activism, art engagement, which is intent versus outcome.
And
So
still, art is
art is
not this simple, right?
no,
Every
because
artist is
there's
different, doing different things, and the work changes as you go.
right.
But
And so when we
without
do our assess,
any
yeah,
measure of this kind of thing, you're really kind of left in the lurch. And so we've adapted it to account for that.
yeah, basically all art is contextual. All artistic activism is contextual. And so we actually, when we do our assessments and we do our evaluation, we don't come in and say, hey, these are the measures you need to use in order to be able to determine A, B, and C. What we do is we ask questions.
And they're pretty specific questions, and they're meant for the artists themselves to come up with their own evaluation and then also refine it a bit for themselves.
Right. And
So,
the first
yeah,
set of questions is about intention. And so these are questions like, what is your artistic aim? What sort of affect, I'm sorry,
feelings,
do you
yeah.
do you want to do you want to create in your audience? Then what is your activist goal? What sort of social change? What sort of material impact do you want to have? Very important is, who is your audience? Who do you want to impact? Because that's going to determine what sort of message you put forth, the medium that you might use, and how you might want to express this. And then, very importantly, what do you want your audience to think, to feel, and probably most importantly, what do you want your audience to do? So that's the first set of questions.
Right. And my background as an artist, like the intent thing is like I've seen so many people with intentions not follow through. Like, I got this great idea for a project and they never do it. So I'm a lot more interested in the outcome questions. And those are the following outcome questions. How will you know if it's happened? Right? Um, you made the project and you had this intention. How do we measure that out in the world? What did happen? What surprised you? What would you do differently? And these are all questions that make for better projects moving forward too. So we do this through a few methods.
Yeah, we've created an interactive app in which it's a self-guided sort of planning tool. We do worksheets where people can fill this out as sort of self-reflection. But really, we found the best way to do this is to sit down and meet with artists. And we've done lots of assessments working with both groups of artists and individual artists who are trying to have a social impact, and just talk to them and get them to reflect upon their practice. And in reflecting upon the practice, it makes a stronger practice. But we're going to let you in on the big secret of assessment. It's an open secret, but it is nonetheless a secret, which is this. Most outcomes are impossible to measure. How can you measure a shift in consciousness? How can you measure an idea of a future that planting a little seed that only comes to fruition 15 years later?
Right. And that is such a part of these kinds of projects, like that Helsinki example. In that one day, it's, we can measure that, but the impact of the kid that hugged him and what that kid thinks 10 years later. So, and this gets sort of to my side of things more, which is in the art practice part, which is like asking those questions helps clarifies people's intent and makes
Right.
for better projects.
Yeah, and that's the key, is that we found that essentially most of the work done on assessment Mostly valuable work is actually done on the front end. It's by getting people to think very clearly about their project, about what they want to have happen, who they want to impact, what they want those people to think, feel, and do, makes for actually much more impactful projects. Yes, we can measure some things, that's no doubt, but what most importantly is a clarity of thinking going into the process.
So here's another way to think about intent. It might be a little bit more familiar for those of you that, well, probably all of you, right? Everyone knows this model. This is
I had to
the,
learn it in grad school for sure.
yeah,
The Shannon and Weaver model of communication. Lay it on us,
yes.
Steve.
So the Shannon-Weaver model of communication, the idea is that the speaker has an idea. In this case, the thought is a tree. They encode that into language, the word tree. It's heard by the listener. They hear the word tree and then decode it into this image, right?
Easy peasy.
Yeah, super
But
simple.
art's not that simple.
No,
No.
no,
Oh,
and
yeah.
whenever you talk about outcomes too, like people start asking about
Ah,
propaganda.
yes.
Right. And so we started making this model of propaganda, which is they think the same kind of dynamic works, which it doesn't, but we'll get to that. So there's a political idea, right? And they encode that into propaganda. The propaganda is a poster or it's an online video, whatever it might be. It's seen by the viewer and decoded. And then that viewer understands this political idea. And it's kind of it's also called the injection model, right, Steve? I think that's maybe what you
Yeah.
learned it
It
as.
was a sort of the 30s model of propaganda.
Right. And it goes back to the point we keep making, which is art is never this simple, right? Like art doesn't work in that kind of direct way. It works in a very different way. And I've been an art professor for a long time, and through working with my students and talking to Steve and stuff, we came up with this, which is I don't know if you've heard of this one. It's the Duncombe and Lambert model of artistic activism, where the artist has a multitude of ideas, right? And they're mixed together. And those get encoded into an artwork. That artwork functions like a prism. And then a rainbow of meaning comes out the other side that's experienced by the viewer, and the viewer has ideas. The ideas are related to the artist's ideas, but it's not a one-to-one exchange, right? Like the idea isn't for the artist and the viewer to have the same thought. It's to inspire thought, and if there's a surplus, that's great.
Yeah.
So
And
go
and
ahead.
one thing that's really key about this, of course, anybody who's worked with a prism knows that the way to get the best rainbows is to have a very sharp beam of white light go into it.
Yeah,
That is you have to have the clarity of the intent
the
and also be,
focus.
yeah, the focus, but be okay with the idea that there is going to be a multiplicity of outcomes, a multiplicity of meanings that are generated by that.
Now, the other thing about this kind of propaganda idea is that it's really outdated. This is from the 30s, right? The fear is that you're going to have you put up this Nazi propaganda and then everyone in the population becomes Nazis, right? And for one, art doesn't work that way, but propaganda doesn't even really work this way anymore. And so we updated the propaganda model for the contemporary times, our
Right.
times,
Right.
and it looks like
And they,
this.
yeah, exactly. And this is the genius of, say, the contemporary propaganda, which is we call the Putin model of propaganda because he's so good at it. But it's actually what Donald Trump uses as well, which is you don't necessarily try to replace one idea with another idea and inject it into someone else. Instead, what you do is you create a multiplicity of possibilities, right? It could be this, it could be that, it might be that, and such and such. And in the end, what ends up happening is with all of this sort of multitude of ideas, people just get confused. They
Yeah,
walk away.
there's no way to really find out what's true or real, what actually happened, what it means. There's just too much stuff to decipher. And so the outcome, which I think is intended, the desired
Yes.
outcome is for people just to give up.
Yeah.
And who
And just
benefits from a system like that?
exactly the leader.
Yeah.
And then the perversity of it actually is then also what they do is look for a strong, usually man, who's going to give them clarity. Um,
Right. Right. Yeah. brilliant and disgusting. Now
Why are we
artists
talking
have
about
a
propaganda, Steve? We're supposed to be talking about art,
yeah,
right?
we're talking about art. So let's talk about one of the biggest deal art shows in the world, which is the Whitney Biennial, and specifically at the 2017 Whitney Biennial. We're just going to use this as kind of an example to talk about this. So, Steve, in order to give context to this, can you tell us about this young man?
Yeah, this is Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old young African American man who in 1955 went from Chicago down to Mississippi to visit his family, had some interaction with a white woman in a store. She accused him of making sexual advances. He was taken out of his house later that night, lynched, killed, thrown into a river, and died. He was taken out of the river, brought back to Chicago, and his mother made a decision about his death. She insisted that the casket, even though he had been shot in the face and he was horribly disfigured after being in the water for 3 days, that the casket would be an open casket public funeral. Tens of thousands of people attended over multiple days, and it became a spectacle which highlighted the horror of white supremacist violence against blacks and the continuation of lynching, and was one of those things in the 1950s, along with Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat, which became one of the sort of the generators, the resurgence of the civil rights movement in the United States. It was a
Right.
performance. I mean, it was a
Yeah.
performance.
And it's hard to explain the impact, but we can give you some idea, and based on the research that we've done, it's that thousands of people came over multiple days to this
Tens,
funeral,
tens of thousands, actually.
and it inspired other rallies in other places.
Yeah.
And of course, it made the news media, right? So as far as a affective experience at aiming at
Effective,
effect,
Steve.
yeah,
Effective, yes. I'm
this
using
has all
your
those.
pronunciation.
But we were talking about the Whitney Biennial. So the Whitney Biennial is every 2 years, and it's a big deal for artists to it's kind of like what's happening now, right? And in 2017, one of the artists was a woman named Danaschutz, and her work has always kind of responded to the contemporary culture. And a big part of contemporary culture in 2016 and 2017 was uh, like the awareness and understanding, a new understanding of a violence against young black men. And I think Danaschutz was saddened by this, and her work is as a painter, right? So she decided to paint a painting of Emmett Till's funeral, and she took a big risk in doing this. And I think and she talked about knowing that when she made the painting, that she knew it would be difficult, and that but she decided to do it anyway and include it in one of these big, you know, art shows that would be talked about and reviewed. And I think wanted to impact that conversation. So the painting that she made looked like this at the opening. It was there, and it's hard to get an idea of what a painting is like over a Zoom connection, but people described it as impactful. But at the same time, there was an immediate controversy. And there was a protest the first day, and it was in the New York Times, the Guardian in the UK, the Washington Post, and
And what? Oh, go sorry.
the conversation around it, yeah, I think
It, yeah,
got way out from where she wanted it to be.
right. The
To
conversation was no longer about white violence among black youth. It was about the art world. It was about who has the right to represent. It's about the responsibility of the museum. What were some of the other issues, Steve?
Well, one was, should the artwork be able to be sold? And then there was
Right.
another question, because someone called for it to be destroyed.
Right.
So then that became the four kind of big questions that were asked.
Right. And so it had an immense amount of impact, right? Both effect and affect, but it wasn't in the direction that, taking the artist at at her word, that she wanted it to go. It really had no impact on the discourse around violence against young Black men.
Right. I mean, it became much more about her and the artwork rather than politics, power, or the murder of young Black men.
Right. And so the
Now,
question is why? What happened?
right. And I think that's the funny thing about these two different things if we look at them as through these questions that we are asking, right?
Yeah, because the Mammy Till, Emmett Till's mother, had a very clear intentionality. She knew what she was doing, and when she actually created this public funeral. And because of that very clear intent of what she wanted to do, how to do it, who her audience was, and what she wanted that audience to think, feel, and do, it had an immense impact, that funeral, on the civil rights movement and publicizing lynching of Black people in the United States.
And the irony here is that this painter, without sort of as well-meaning as they were, kind of ended up being one of the elements in this sort of model that we described before, right? It's another piece of information, a perspective, a way of looking at things that becomes part of the mess of media and conversation that can contribute to people kind of resigning and not knowing what to do. And the sad part of this is at the end of that exhibition, all that controversy, really there nothing changed, right? Maybe 20 years from now we'll be able to know that this, some kind of knock-on effect, but there's really at this point nothing that we can point to where that work had an impact on anything material, right? Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say. And so the question again goes back to, well, what could have been a different path? And so, a different path could have been really thinking about the clarity of intent and, asking a simple set of questions by the artist, which were these notions of, well, what do I want my work to do in terms of its affect and its effect, who the audience is and what they want them to think, feel, and do. Now, as sociologists, I think we, of course we would ask these sorts of questions. So Steve,
Right.
you're the artist. Like, why doesn't the artist who wants to have a political impact just sit down and do that?
I think it's really easy to think of the artist who made this as like running into this thing kind of foolish, maybe even ignorant of what the impact would be. But we happen to have been born in the same year and had a
Mm,
similar education. Like I went to art school at an art institute. She went to a major university for an MFA after that. We have the same degrees, different schools, but I know that that training isn't there, right? These questions are not what you learn as an artist. And I really think that she's the product of an education system and an art system that discourages anything but what she did. That kind of approach of like, I'm exploring, I want to present a perspective, like that is so common in that education and in that system. And I think to give her credit, she was attempting even to break out of it, but without the tools to do it, without
right.
the
It,
background for it.
yeah, and so I think the challenge we're going to put out to you as, social scientists who are interested in the arts is really helping artists to think about impact and to ask these questions, which aren't necessarily part of art education in the art world, but are very much part of the education of the social sciences, and thinking about sort of partnerships that can be had between social scientists and artists, very much like the partnership that Steve and I have with one another, where we ask each other series of questions which aren't part of our training, and through that actually develop a much more powerful hybrid practice.
And I think too, going back to that idea that we think that art has escaped this instrumentality, that it's, by not being connected to benefactors or imagining that we're not. I mean, it still is, but really to embrace the idea that all art is actually instrumental, right?
Lean into it.
Yeah,
Right.
it's a matter of who it's for, and instead of pretending that it's not, embrace it, take ownership of it in a way, reflect upon its instrumentality, and in the
And
end,
and our role, as speaking myself as a sociologist, is to help people improve upon it. If art is instrumental, let's make it really good instrumental art. Because in the end, art has to move us. If it doesn't move you, it leaves us standing still. And it really, in order to have that effect, it has to have affect. But in order for affect to be effective, it needs that sort of clarity. It needs that sort of rigor. And I think that's one thing that sociologists can actually bring to this, and people interested in the social sciences and that way of thinking.
yeah. So we just want to thank you for your attention. And if we were actually in Helsinki with all of you, at this point, we would announce where we would be eating lunch and that you are welcome to join us and ask questions. We can't do that, so we do want to let you know that we are not. We you can reach us, right? So if there's questions you have, or if there was something in here that you found just completely confounding or a big oversight, we want to know. And we have office hours at the end of the month that we offer to people, and or you can just write us and we can set up a meeting.
Yeah.
So
And just all you have to do is Google Center for Artistic Activism and we will pop up.
yeah, c4aa.org if you can remember that, but
Yeah.
you'll find us.
All
And we look
right.
forward to it.
Wherever you are, we wish we would go get I don't know, aquavit. What do we drink? What do we drink in Finland? Something of that nature. At lunch with you, but we can't do that. So we'll just wish you goodbye.
Yes. Thanks so much.
Thank you.